Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So yesterday we did the blind pick tier list, and today we're going to do the counter pick tier list. So just like yesterday, I'll timestamp everything below, but I am going to start off by talking about what I think makes a good counter pick, and then we'll kind of just go through champion by champion, just like we did in the previous video. So what makes a good counter pick? I think when you're counter picking, the two things you should think about is your matchup and the enemy team composition. I think these are the two things that you're really trying to counter, and generally if you're a champion that has very hard winning matchups or can snowball off winning matchups very hard, that's very good. Or if you're a champion that just like completely destroys certain team comps, that's very good as well. Now, it's also worth noting that generally neutralizers that are very good blind picks aren't that good at counter picking. I think like while neutralizing an enemy team composition is definitely valuable, it's not as valuable as if just like completely destroying an enemy composition. And so a champion like Ahri that's very good because of her blind pick, she is still an okay counter pick, but it's like, what would we counterpick Ahri into? If we're talking matchups, Ahri doesn't really like destroy any matchup. Like again, she's kind of just a neutralizer. That's why she's a good blind pick. And in terms of counterpicking like enemy team comp, she could be picked as kind of like an answer to a team comp that really punishes immobility. But then there are kind of champions that would punish, those sorts of like dive comps or something harder than Ahri would. So I'd say Ahri is like more of a mid-tier counter. We'll talk about that specifically. But what I'm basically trying to say is you really want, when you're counterpicking, you want to try just like pick a champ that like hard destroys your matchup or like completely shuts down the enemy team comps. And generally when you're counterpicking, things that aren't as valuable are going to be things that are just like decent against the enemy team. You really want to get a lot of value out of that counter pick. So I'll be valuing these things very highly when I rank the champions on this list. I also think when compared to blind picking, you don't need to think about your team composition as much when you're counter picking. It's still a factor, but it's definitely a way bigger factor when you're blind picking. And since you already have information like on the enemy matchup or the enemy team composition, you probably already have enough reasons to make a champion good, even if it doesn't necessarily fit with your team comp. That being said, if you can get something that fits your team comp, like that's great, but I wouldn't say it's something that you like majorly need to factor in like when you do when you're blind picking. Let's get started with the list itself. Just like yesterday, S tier will be for like the premier counter picks. A will be for champions that are pretty good at counter picking, pretty solid choices. B will be for champions that can be counter picked, but I think there are normally better counter picks available. C will probably be for champions that I don't really recommend counter picking, and D would be champions that I would personally never counter pick with. But to be honest, like pretty much every champion in the game can be used as a counter pick, but it's like, would you get more value out of a different champion, or is the champion that you're picking like better suited for a blind pick? So let's start with Aatrox. Now Aatrox, like I said yesterday, is a pretty solid blind. He's also a pretty solid counter pick. I would say he's like kind of a mid A, like maybe a low A. The thing is, he's a very good counter to melee champions. So pretty much any melee assassin, bruiser or whatever, tank mids like Galio set or whatever, but he's not a great counter to mages. Like he does fine against mages, but I wouldn't say he's like a counter to them. But yeah, I'd say he's somewhere like a low A. Ahri is interesting. I think Ahri is kind of a B, maybe like a low B. So Ahri is way better as a counter pick. The thing is, as a blind pick, counter picking with Ahri is like, there aren't lanes that you really hard destroy. So you could normally just like counter pick your lane harder with something else. It can still be a good choice if you don't know what to pick into the lane, like if you don't have a better counter. And it can be a decent counter compositionally, again, to like dive comps or something that punishes immobility. But I think there are much better champs at doing this. So yeah, about a B. Now, Akali. I would say Akali is probably an S tier counter. Akali is like a really good counter to a lot of mid lane champions. Like again, not all of them, but one of the big weaknesses of Akali is that like very early laning phase and falling behind and like giving up priority early. If you're in a matchup where you don't need to do that, she scales insanely well. And also she has a lot of mobility, so you can pick her into comps that really need to, again, like punish in a mobile target, and Akali just like completely ruins that play for them. So I really like Akali as a counter. I think, yeah, one of the better mid lane counters for sure. Akshan. Akshan is sort of interesting. I would say Akshan is probably an A tier counter pick in my opinion. So the thing with Akshan is that he can be compositionally shut down like by CC a lot. And there are also some mid laners that can beat him in lane with CC, but Akshan snowballs really hard, and if the enemy team doesn't have CC, he's really strong. So if you can get a really good matchup and verse like, yeah, a short range team comp or just a comp that doesn't have a lot of CC, has a lot of squishies, then I think like really, really good option, honestly. Anivia. I would say Anivia is probably like a I'd say like a low A, maybe a high B. I think Anivia has a lot of really good matchups where she can just like, okay, actually, yeah, no, definitely an A. So in terms of matchups, like, there aren't like tons of matchups that Anivia just destroys, but there's a lot of matchups where you can just like keep them like stuck under tower. So like a champion that really needs to roam, if you can just like keep them stuck under tower with your ult, that's really, really valuable. But I think Anivia's real value as a counter comes compositionally. Anivia just destroys short range team compositions. In fact, she should probably be higher up. I actually think maybe even here. It's really like underrated how good Anivia is against short range compositions. Actually insane. So I really value Anivia as a counter pick. Annie. Annie is also a pretty solid counter pick. I'd say somewhere in here. Like Annie again benefits a lot from snowballing, and if she gets like the lane where she can like kill someone at 6 or just gets like a somewhat free lane and gets to start roaming and stuff like that, I think she's really good. Yeah, maybe somewhere in here. Yeah, something like that. Ashe. Now Ashe mid is again actually a pretty good counter. It's just you can't really counter with her often. So I think Ashe would probably be like a high B maybe. I'll just put her in B. So I think the thing with Ashe is that her laning phase is very, very weak. But if you can get a lane where you're not going to get punished and you're against a team of like a lot of immobility, you can do a lot. The real problem with Ashe is that you don't really hard destroy your lane. So it's like even though you're counterpicking, all you're getting is like the ability to scale, which is nice, but it's not like you scale in the same way that say like a Victor does, right? So I wouldn't say she's an amazing counterpick, but she's like a decent champ that you can consider. Aurelion Sol. So I think Aurelion Sol is a very, very good counterpick. I would say somewhere like here. So the thing with Aurelion Sol is he's a champion that can take over the game really early in the game, but most matchups don't permit him to do this. But if you get a matchup where you're allowed to do this, or if you're versus a team comp that can't really punish you again for your kind of short range, I think he's really, really strong. So definitely not a champion that I would like pick all the time, like even as a counter, but situationally, obviously he can be very, very good. Azir. So Azir is probably like, I would say here on average. Like, okay, the thing with Azir, he's very, very good against other mages, and he can also like deal well with a lot of team comps. But I think Azir's main value is as a blind pick, like being very versatile. Azir does like tons of things pretty well, but he doesn't do anything like insanely well. I think like if you want anti-tank, there are better champions at that. If you want like pure mobility, there are better champions like that. Again, like Peel, there are better champions at that. But Azir is just like incredibly well-rounded. But I don't think he's a great counter unless you're countering like another mage. And even then, I think I would prefer like Victor or Syndra, as long as like you didn't need the extra safety. So yeah, like Azir, it can be a good counter pick for sure, but I think a lot of the time you can get more value out of something else. Brand, so Brand, I would say probably like here somewhere. I think it's in the same sort of thing as Ashe, where like if you can get a decent enough matchup and like snowball with this champ, he's really, really strong. But I just think like most of the time, the champs you counter or like that you are going to be picking into, you're still probably not going to have a great time. Like I just don't think Brand's that good overall. Just doesn't have a lot of great mid matchups. But if you can get a free matchup and like snowball, then like he's very, very good. But I just don't think that happens often enough. Okay, Cassio. Cassio is also an S tier counter, so Cassio just absolutely destroys a bunch of champions in lane, melee champions, but particularly melee champions with extended trades. So champions that normally can't go for burst trades, so like Yorn and Silas, like those sorts of champs that need longer trades, but like no champion wins extended trades versus Cassio, right? So Cassio is really, really good against those. Also just like counters short range compositions like really hard. Especially like melee heavy ones. So Cassio, very, very good counter pick. Cho'Gath. I would actually say Cho'Gath is potentially an S tier counter, if not a high A. I'm maybe going to go with S. So I think tank mids are very, very good against assassin mids, especially ones that still build damage. So like Sion or Cho. I think these champions, like they can just completely destroy the lane a lot of the time if you get a good matchup, and also they're like impossible to kill and they scale well. So I'm a big fan of tank mids, especially ones that like build damage on the side. So yeah, I quite like the Cho and the Sion and stuff like that. Corki. So Corki is, and it's like okay. I'd say it's like kind of like here. Like I think the thing is Corki is just Yeah, actually, no, it should be a bit higher. It should be somewhere like here. So the thing with Corki, he scales very well, obviously, but there aren't many matchups that you're going to pick Corki into and be like, okay, now I'm going to destroy this guy. I think compositionally, if you can pick Corki as like a poke champ versus a team with no engage, you can get a lot done. But I still think most of the time there are definitely like better champs you can counterpick with than Corki. Diana. So Diana's actually a pretty good counterpick. I think the reason I just rate Diana kind of low in general is because I think she's just like a way better jungler. But you can play Diana mid, and if you get a good matchup as Diana and can snowball, like it is actually quite impressive. I think compositionally though, I'm not sure like okay, if you picked this maybe would be one where you need to think about your team comp. Like if you were picking Diana and you already had like a Yasuo on your team, or you had like a lot of other engaged, so like an Ornn or a Leona or something, then Diana can be very good with that. And especially against, again, like an enemy team comp that has a lot of immobility, I think Diana could be really good. But I do just prefer her in the jungle, but like, yeah, you can make it work. Ekko. Ekko is Ekko used to be a better counter, but these days is just not that good. I'd honestly put Ekko maybe about here. So Ekko is similar in design to Ahri, where like he has mobility and he's meant to neutralize lanes. And I don't think Ekko has the ability to really take over a lane, like a champion like Akali might. You know, like I think the kind of champions that you pick these ones into normally is stuff like Syndra, where they kind of struggle at people like jumping on them. And people kind of like taking over the lane against them. Champs have a lot of mobility. So Ekko used to really fill that role, but I think Akali just does it better now. So yeah, not a huge fan of Ekko as a counter. What else do we have? Fizz. So I think Fizz is also an S tier counter. Fizz is a champion that can snowball insanely hard, and if he's in a good matchup, can get like a lot of kills. Like this is a champion that can make certain lanes just like completely unplayable for your opponent. I think the thing that made Fizz harder to like pick in general this season is that you need to snowball harder to be more useful. But like he still has the ability to snowball hard, but a lot of the matchups they became harder to kill. And kind of like, yeah, some of the enemy team comps, like if they have a lot of shields or something like that, can be annoying. But if you get like a good matchup and the enemy team comp is sort of useless or, you know, not good against you, Fizz is like a champion that can absolutely like 1v9 the game, can take over completely. Galio. So Galio is honestly the first champ I'm going to put down here. I think that you can pick Galio versus Assassins. Like he can be a counter pick. But I think the real strength of Galio is that you can pick him early in the draft with a champion like Jarvan or Camille or something like that, and know that you're just like always going to be impactful, and you just like don't really need to care about your matchup whatsoever. And like you can counter certain assassins with Galio, and like you'll counter them in team fights, but you don't really counter them that hard in lane. There are actually some assassins that can beat Galio in lane, although to be fair, not that many. So yeah, I don't really value Galio very highly as a counter. I really think this is like, in my mind, or at least in my opinion, right? It's like strictly a counterpick. Obviously, you can counterpick Galio, right? Like you definitely can. But I really think he's way more valuable as a blind. Now, we're going to start putting some like weird champs on this list. So Fiora, I would say if you play Fiora mid, she is really good against other like melees. I think the only reason like she doesn't quite make it to S is because like one, having a Fiora mid on your team can make your team comp very wonky. And also it's like, how often are you going to verse the kind of champs mid that Fiora counters like those other fighters? Honestly, not that often. And like I wouldn't want to play versus a mage personally, so it's a champ you could consider, but you're probably just, it's like, okay, if you're going to learn Fiora, if you already know how to play Fiora, you can get value out of her. If you're wanting to put time into learning Fiora, it's probably better spent elsewhere, at least in my opinion. Gragas, I think Gragas is actually another really good counter pick, would probably be in here somewhere. I think Gragas does really well against melee champions, can just like perma-CC them to death. I think I could just be wrong on this, but I feel like compositionally, Gragas doesn't like hard counter certain comps. Like I guess maybe melee heavy comps again that you can just eat on cooldown, or perhaps like teams with immobility that you can like flank and ult them in. But there's never a time where I'm like, and I mean, again, this could just be because like I'm not really a Gragas player, but there's never a time where I'm just like the enemy team comp just like screams Gragas to me. So could be a thing for you guys, but for me, I would say not really. Heimer. Heimer is somewhere up in here. I think Heimer can be a really good counter, but it's like a lot of the things you get out of counterpicking as Heimer, you're going to get out of blind picking Heimer anyway, because people aren't going to know what to pick into Heimer and stuff anyway. I think like if you can get a melee matchup that you can just like completely neutralize, just perma push on a tower, and the enemy team has a bunch of short range, then Heimerdinger is very, very strong, like potentially up here somewhere. But I think a lot of the time you're just going to get the same out of blind picking him, but it's not like he's a bad counterpick. In fact, he's like a pretty good blind pick, or sorry, a pretty good counterpick, but he's actually just, you're going to get the same stuff out of blind picking, I think, most of the time. Aurelia. So I think Aurelia is another S tier counter. I would say, in fact, Aurelia is probably the highest one on the list so far. So the thing with Aurelia is that she snowballs insanely hard, and there are a lot of matchups that she just completely destroys. The biggest problem with picking Aurelia is the enemy team composition, and maybe a little bit like, do you have a full AD team? But I think if you get a good game as Aurelia, the champion is just insane, and it's one of those champions where, like, you know, if the enemy team picks a bunch of stuff that say can't deal with Aurelia well, and then the enemy team locks in Aurelia, the game feels like really, really bad. You know, it's not like one of these champions where it's like, that's annoying, but we can deal with it. It's like, no, this champ is going to make this game unplayable. So I think Aurelia, very, very good counter. Jayce. Jayce, what do I think about Jayce? Like, Jayce is a pretty good counter, honestly. Like, he does kind of well into some melees, but the only, I don't know, I think there are kind of better champs, you know, like I think there are other champs mid that destroy melees harder. And if we're talking like tankier mids, you'd rather play something like Vayne, I think. So like it can be good. I'm kind of tempted to put it down here. I'm just not a huge fan of Jayce mid overall, but yeah, I guess you make it work. So Karma, this is another one. I think Karma is generally not a counter pick. Like, the time to pick like, okay, so Karma can't really destroy lanes, but she could counter an assassin. But I think, again, it's like you can't really destroy the assassin lane. You're just going to neutralize them, which I'm not a huge fan of. But I think compositionally, she does have some use cases as a counter pick. Like if the enemy team picks Karthus, for example, Karma is really good. Or if the enemy team really needs to burst down, like, or like they have a lot of bursts at the start of the fight, but then they kind of run out of damage. Karma can be very good for that. So actually, Karma like has some use cases as a counter pick, but I really think she's a much better blind. Karthus. So Karthus is a pretty solid counter. I'd say somewhere in here. He's like pretty solid. Very good against teams like without any form of like immunity or sustain or something like that. Basically when your ult is going to hit and when it's going to stick. Like I think that's really important. I also think matchup wise, there are a lot of pretty good matchups for Karthus mid. Like a lot of champions you can really bully out in the early game. And actually a big part of like counterpicking with Karthus is if you can get enough priority over mid in order to farm the enemy raptors. Because as Karthus, you want to farm like as fast as possible. And so if you're against a champion that can really like deny you from getting priority or like punishes you in lane, it can be really hard to get kind of like that 10 CSPM or even more that you want on Karthus. But if you're against a free matchup as Karthus, like you can completely take over the game. So yeah, I think he's pretty solid as a counter. Kassadin. Kassadin, without a doubt, is an S tier counter. I would probably say is like probably about here. I think Kassadin, like again, if you get a matchup where you can snowball or it's at least a free matchup is very, very good. Obviously, if the enemy has like lots of AP on their team or they have low amounts of CC, Kassadin can be very, very valuable. Definitely one of the better champs to put time into if you're looking for a counter because he's like, he has like kind of a difficult play style in my opinion, but mechanically he's quite easy to pick up. And you're going to get a lot of value out of him. Like this is a champ that you can counter pick with like very often and just like win a ton of games with it. Katarina. So Katarina is definitely better used as a counter pick than a blind pick in my opinion. And I think she is pretty good at this. I don't think she is as good as some of the other assassins. I'd probably put her right about here where like, again, like she can snowball some matchups. It's great. She can verse a team comp without much CC. That makes the game a lot easier. But I still think other assassins like have more kill threat and just generally do more. But Katarina, much better as a counter than a blind in my opinion. Kayle. Kayle is a weird one. I'm not too sure. I feel like Kayle, you kind of need to think about like what your team is picking a little. Like having an aggressive jungler like Hecarim or something with Kayle makes the game a lot easier. I guess like, yeah, it probably is like similar to Karthus where it's a champion that can farm very quickly and if you get a free matchup just like takes over. And I guess again, like if you're versus an enemy team comp that doesn't have much CC, Kayle gets a lot of value, but there's like a lot of things to think about. She is like really good in that situation, but I feel like most of those situations I would prefer to be a different champ. But yeah, I think it works. What else do we have here? Kennen. I think Kennen's a really good counter. There's a lot of matchups mid where Kennen can just destroy, again, against melee champions. Like, you destroy the lane, you destroy them in team fights and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of similar to Anivia. Kennen just, like, completely destroys a lot of melee champions, like, role in the game. And he snowballs very hard as well. So I'm a pretty big fan of Kennen as a counter pick as well. LeBlanc. So LeBlanc used to be a very good blind, now is more of a counter, and I would say she is a very good counter. If you can snowball as LeBlanc, the champ is actually kind of ridiculous. I think Season 12 made it a bit harder, again, because people have shields, and there's like more comeback mechanics and durability, and you know, there's like a lot of stuff in the meta that makes it more difficult, but it's still like, if you don't get countered as LeBlanc, you're gonna have a very good time. I'm kind of hesitant to put her S tier just because I feel like, again, there are probably better champs you could pick, like up here, if you just got like a completely free matchup, but I still think LeBlanc is an extremely good counter. Like, yeah, it's definitely a high A for me. Okay, Lissandra. So Lissandra is probably somewhere in here. Okay, maybe it's like about here. So I think, no, okay, I'll put it a low A. So the thing with Lissandra is that she's not as good as a blind as she used to, but she's become kind of more defined as a counterpick to champions that also have a weak lane, so they can't punish Lissandra early. And particularly ones that are really reliant on like not getting CC'd in team fights and stuff like that. So against assassins or against champions like Ahri, it can be really good. Compositionally, I think if you can pair yourself with a bunch of dive on your team, that's very good as well. So yeah, I think it's a pretty decent counter. It could maybe be like, yeah, somewhere in here. It's solid, but not amazing. Where are we up to down here? Lucian, I guess? Yeah, Lucian. So Lucian, very similar to Akshan, used to be very, very strong, but it's kind of just fallen off a bit. I honestly think they're very similar champs at the moment. Maybe Lucian could be a bit higher. I feel like Lucian can farm quicker than Akshan can. So yeah, maybe I put him like right here. He's definitely a little bit higher. Like Lucian can take over games, not so much in terms of kills. Like Akshan definitely gets more kills and more roams, but Lucian can farm a lot more. So it kind of depends what sort of matchup you're into. Like I think Akshan would be looking for a matchup that he can really hard snowball off of, whereas Lucian would look for a matchup that is not going to stop him from just like farming a ton of CS and like really dominating the lane. But you don't normally get a ton of lane kills on Lucian. You can if your opponent messes up. And I guess actually that's going to happen quite a lot in solo queues. So yeah, I'd say somewhere like there, in my opinion. Lulu. Lulu as a counter pick is actually really good. I would say somewhere like here. Yeah, somewhere like here. So Lulu is extremely good at just like ruining an assassin's day. But okay, the thing is, Lulu is very good in her niche cases where you're like cucking an enemy assassin and you have like a champion that you can buff on your team, and the enemy team comp like doesn't have a lot of range. So like she's stronger in her niche scenario, but she can't be picked as often as say Lissandra. Like you could probably pick Lissandra against like literally every assassin and not worry about anything else. But Lulu, you have to be quite specific with how you use her. But you know, when you kind of get a good situation for her, I think she's quite good. Lux. Lux is honestly not a very good counter in my opinion. A lot of her strength comes from blind picking. She does have some things she's a good counter to, but I think in general, like she's much better as a blind pick. And there's nothing that really is like, you know, if you pick a bunch of champs and the enemy team picks Lux, are you like terrified now? I would say not really. Yeah, I'd say like it's a champion that can be countered, but I would much prefer to see her as a blind most of the time. Malphite. Now Malphite, I would actually say is a high A, potentially an S. Potentially an S. So I think if you're against a like full AD team and you pick Malphite mid and you know how to play it, he's probably an S. But I think like it's just not going to happen that often. Like how often is the enemy going to have like full AD and a mid matchup that's good for you? In my opinion, not that often. But Malphite does snowball pretty hard in my opinion. Like you've got a pretty strong lane against some of the AD assassins and like obviously you become unkillable. But I kind of hesitate to put him higher than like here at the moment. But in his very best situations, it can be much higher. But I think on average, it's going to be somewhere about here. Where are we on the list? Malzahar. So Malzahar is quite a good counter. I'd say somewhere like here. Here maybe. So the thing with Malzahar is he has a very, very weak lane. And that's like his biggest problem. But he scales like an absolute monster. He just does tons of damage. And you can like completely ruin enemy comps with Malzahar. Like if they're a team that really needs to go in and you ult like one of those key targets when they go in and then you spread your damage onto everyone else, like Malzahar can just completely ruin their game. And if you don't fall behind in lane as Malzahar, like that's the one kind of point in the game when you really fall behind. So if you can get away with that, I think Malzahar is really, really strong. Mord, again, pretty good counter, kind of similar to like Fiora and stuff like that. Just very good at versing other melees. Pretty solid counter in my opinion. Like can really just destroy comps, especially like one threat comps. Like if the enemy team has a bunch of champs that buff one champ and then you just ult them, I think that can be really good as well. So I quite like Mord. Nico used to be a lot better of a counter. I kind of she's still quite good against melee heavy comps, but yeah, she just doesn't do as well as she used to. I'd probably say somewhere like right here. She used to be a lot better. It's kind of sad. Okay, Nocturne mid. So Nocturne did just get nerfed, so I'm not sure if he's as insane as before, but just like in general, Nocturne is very good as a counterpick mid. I'm not really sure he is after the nerf. But like Nocturne typically is a very good champion against other melees, and Snowball's pretty hard, can roam around the map, good in 2v2s, so has a lot of things going for him. Also used to be a blind pick, feels like he's not anymore, but did used to be. Orianna. So Orianna is another champion that kind of fits in here where like you can counter with Orianna, but she's definitely better as a blind. I think Orianna can take over a lane like harder than a champion like Ahri can. So I'd probably put her about here, but I think most of the time you can be like greedier or more punishing with your counter pick than just an Orianna. Ornn. So Ornn is very similar to a champion like Malphite or Sion. These are just very good champs against like assassins. I would say Ornn is, yeah, probably up here. Or the thing is, Ornn does a lot of damage, but sometimes it's not meaningful damage. Like if you can get your damage on the right target, it's good, but it's harder to reach the right target compared to a champion like Cho'Gath or Malphite. So that kind of makes me want to put him like down here, but I do think Ornn is like pretty good. I'll probably just put him with Malphite. Like, yeah, he's one of the good tanks. But I do think the other tanks are a little better. But Ornn is like really good as well. Ornn is really good as well. Okay, Pantheon. Pantheon is a very good counter. Destroys other melee champions, and obviously Snowball's quite hard, so I will put him somewhere in there, I'm thinking. Actually, it shouldn't be quite that high because he doesn't scale well enough. Somewhere like, maybe like there, I think. Similar kind of role to Nocturne. What else have we got? Okay, Qiyana. I think Qiyana is an S tier counter, maybe an A+. No, I think I'm going to make it an S. So I think Qiyana is a champion that snowballs insanely hard, can destroy certain team compositions, and if she gets a lane that she can snowball off, she just goes absolutely crazy. So I think if you get good games as Qiyana, absolutely look to pick her. Her biggest weakness is the laning phase, and if you get a good lane, you can just like completely take over the game. Quinn, yeah, you can definitely play Quinn mid, and it's a good counter to melee champions. Also can snowball reasonably hard, kind of a little bit team reliant. Need to have some AP on your team, but also prefer not to verse a bunch of CC on the enemy team. I think Quinn, similar to Akshan and Lucian, except she scales kind of well in the side lane. Somewhere like there, I think. What have we got next? Where am I looking? Okay, Rumble. Actually, I'll put Riven on here. I think Renekton is just not as good as he used to be, so I'm not really going to put him on here. It did used to be good, but I think Riven is still quite a good counter. I'd say Riven's actually very high tier. Riven can snowball insanely hard in a lot of melee matchups. And I think Riven's not too worried about team comp. It's just mainly finding a lane that you can snowball really hard off. And if you can, I think Riven, very valuable. Rumble. Rumble's not an amazing counter. He is quite good versus melees, but you can also blind him and like do well against most things. I'd maybe put Rumble somewhere up here where I think, yeah, maybe like there. Yeah, actually like here. Actually, I should move these around a bit. Maybe, no, I'll just keep it. They're roughly the same, I think. Like you can counter lanes and do well into them, but you don't really have the ability to take over the game as well as some of the other champs do. But yeah, somewhere in there I think is fair for Rumble. Ryze, I think, again, not a great counter, honestly. Like a huge amount of Ryze's strength comes from his blind pick ability. So you could counter pick with Ryze, but again, there are just like going to be better counters most of the time. I guess like if you did want to counter pick Ryze, it'd be again against short range team comps, champs that can't stop you from farming mid, and just like trying to snowballs and like roam around the map as much as possible. But I really think Ryze is such a solid blind that there's not really any reason to use him as a counter. Seraphine. Seraphine can be used as a counter, but again is kind of just yeah, no, I'll put her in here as well. She's another champion where like you could counter pick with Seraphine, but like she'll basically do the same thing when you're blind picking. The only difference really is that you avoid having a very bad matchup. So maybe that puts her about here. Like if you can get a matchup where you don't get destroyed, that's kind of nice. But yeah, she's just kind of a mid-tier counter, I would say. We've got some others here. Okay, Singed I think is a very solid counter, especially against immobile mids. In fact, I'd say Singed is like potentially an S tier counter if you're good at him. But I think I'll put him like here for now. And similarly to that, I think Sion, probably an S tier counter, very, very good against melees or against mages that don't have anti-tank. You know, if you play Sion against a champion like Ahri, you're just getting like a completely free lane and you outscale her super, super hard. And again, if you can play against a champion with lower wave clear, you can easily look to farm. So I'm a big fan of Sion mid as well. Moving on. Swain. Now, Swain is a really, really good counter. I'd say somewhere like up here. If you get a good matchup as Swain, you can definitely take over the game. Doesn't snowball as hard as some of the other champions, like in terms of just killing people, but it's more like any kill that Swain gets is very snowballing because he's very hard to kill, stays alive a long time. So even though he doesn't get as much gold as other champs, it's like any gold that he does get is extremely valuable. Sylas. Sylas, without a doubt, an S tier counter. I'd probably say somewhere up here, maybe. The thing with Sylas is that you're looking to counter like matchups and compositions. And if you can get either of them, it already makes him quite good. Like if you get a good matchup and good ults as Sylas, he'd potentially even be over here. But I do think the one thing that kind of is a bit lacking for Sylas is he still can't kill people in lane that easily if they're playing properly. Like you can get a lead, and getting a lead as Sylas is like basically all you need because you're kind of meant to fall behind early. But it's not like you're just gonna kill your opponent 10 times unless you like get really ahead. Whereas like some of these champions definitely will if they get like, you know, a pretty good matchup. So he's pretty solid, but not quite as good as those ones. But like he's still very good, right? Still very good. Syndra. Syndra is also a very good counter pick. I'd honestly put her similar to LeBlanc, where she's extremely good at snowballing in her good matchups. She does have kind of a lot of bad matchups, but has some gank setup and stuff as well. Yeah, I'd say she's somewhere like here. Actually, maybe not quite this high, just because she isn't as good at countering compositions as a champion like LeBlanc. Maybe she's like more like here. But yeah, Syndra is a very solid counter in my opinion, especially if you get a mage matchup that you can really look to take over. Taliyah. I think Taliyah is definitely very high on this list. She counters people in lane and compositionally. Like even though she can't really kill people in lane, she can neutralize them, and then in team fights she can just make some champions completely useless. On top of that, she scales really, really well. So definitely a high A for me. Talon. I think Talon is another very good counter. Not quite S. Well, okay. The thing with Talon is that okay, I'm gonna put it here. So the thing is, Talon has really high snowball ability, kind of like Fizz. Like he can get kills in lane, he can run around the map and just completely take over. Now the thing is, it's a bit easier to counter Talon compositionally because again, he is likely to be on a heavier AD team, whereas like Fizz is probably like the only AP on his team normally. And also armor items are generally better than MR items as a whole. So he's like a bit more counterable, but honestly, he probably deserves to be an S tier counter. Like Talon can completely take over the game if you get the right matchup and situation for him. Tristana, I guess, is our next one here. So Tristana is a pretty solid counter, but she kind of falls in the same thing as all these other ADCs of just like, I think other champions kind of scale harder. Although, like to be fair, Trist can snowball the hardest of any of these AD carries, but you really have to get a lot out of her, in my opinion, and I think she's also just better as an ADC, but yeah, can be picked. Tryndamere. Tryndamere is, in my opinion, probably an S tier counter. I'd say somewhere like here, maybe. I think Tryndamere can... or maybe here. Tryndamere can absolutely destroy certain lanes, and he's very hard to deal with. And there also aren't that many comps that deal well with Trynd, especially in solo queues, so definitely one you can look out for here. Twisted Fate. Twisted Fate is another champion that I probably would not counter with. So, okay, there are some times to use TF, which is like, if the enemy team picks a bunch of lanes that need to play really aggressive. So let's say you have something like Draven bot, and they also have Jayce top. That's 2 lanes that need to be playing very aggressively at all times. And the jungler can't be everywhere at once. So as a counterpick against these sorts of comps, Twisted Fate can be very good, but that is like kind of too high level for solo queue in my opinion. Like solo queue is just, it's too dumb. It's not going to play out like that. So I would stick to using TF as a counter, but there are times when TF actually is a good counter compositionally. But I think in solo queue probably doesn't happen that often, and I would prefer to see him as a blind. Varus. So Varus is pretty good. Yeah, like he's got some good matchups, but the thing is, you're just not going to pick him very often. Like the matchups that Varus counters, you would probably prefer to counter with something else most of the time. So yeah, I don't really think it's worth putting the time into learning him, but like if you do, there are some times that you'll get use out of him. Veigar. So Veigar used to be a bit better. I mean, like, okay, the thing with Veigar, still a good counter compositionally to shorter range comps, but can't really beat any lane. Like, he doesn't really counter any lane whatsoever. So I feel like that kind of has to put him, like, somewhere here. Like, again, he can counter compositions, and he does counter compositions quite hard, but after his Cage got nerfed, like, Predator got nerfed, and he just, like, doesn't really beat matchups. I don't know, he kind of feels sort of meh to me as, like, a counter. Somewhere in there, I think. Vayne. Vayne is definitely a very good counter. Again, not a champion that you will pick very often, but into the champs that Vayne is good at, Vayne is like really good against. If you play against like tankier champs or tankier comps, Vayne gets a lot of value. Now, the only thing, again, with Vayne is like, she kind of ruins your own team comp. If you don't have like other CC on your team or you don't have like AP on your team. So be very careful of that. But if you get the very best situation for Vayne, she does get like a lot of value. So Vel'Koz. Vel'Koz, yeah, just a B. I don't really feel that strongly about a Vel'Koz counterpick, if I'm honest. Really, I just think like most of the champs that you'd pick Vel'Koz into, you would rather pick other champs into, at least in my opinion. Vex, pretty good counter, somewhere in here, can completely destroy melees. Maybe actually should be higher than this. Maybe should be higher than this. Okay, but high A, maybe low S. Like, she does very well against certain champions. I think I will give her a low S. Like, I think there are some champions that Vex just, like, completely removes from the game, basically. And I do think she can counter compositions as well. So I'm a pretty big fan of Vex counterpick. Victor. Victor is one of the best AP mage counterpicks in competitive. But he doesn't really like take over the game that much. Like, he's kind of similar to Azir, where like you will bully out your opponent quite a lot, but like you don't really get kills off it normally. You do scale quite well. Like, don't get me wrong, these Azir and Victor, like they're good counters, but it's just like they're better counters. Like, I would probably say if I'm looking to just like crush a mage matchup, I'd probably pick like Cinder or something, right? And if I'm really looking to like you know, maybe like snowball the early game or something, maybe I'd pick like LeBlanc or something like that. Or if I want to play something like really greedy, you know, maybe I can look for, you know, maybe then you can look for some of those like compositionally. I guess like, yeah, compositionally, Victor probably should be somewhere in here. Like if you just get a comp where you can just deal damage for free and no one can really hurt you, I think he gets a lot of value. And he is very good against other mages, but he kind of doesn't kill them, which is the only problem. Like, I think a lot of the champs, when they play against Victor, they can kind of just be like, okay, yeah, I will just take as much sustain as I can, look to neutralize, and not really interact too much. So, next is Vlad. Now, Vlad is a very good counterpick. There are a lot of champions that cannot play against Vlad at all, and he's a champion that snowballs very hard, so I'm a pretty big fan of Vlad counterpick. I think also compositionally, there are some comps that just cannot deal with Vlad whatsoever, especially ones with no forms of CC. They would just get completely destroyed. Xerath. Xerath is honestly like maybe about here. I actually think Xerath can kill people in lane. And Yeah, he's like a bit better at Victor at this. Like he can kill people in lane, and also you can impact the map a bit more early. And there are some comps where if you get outranged by Xerath and you don't have any sustain or any engage, you can just get like destroyed by Xerath the rest of the game. So I'd actually say Xerath is like maybe about here. Like he can actually be a really good counter in the right games. Yone and Yasuo. This is interesting. I think Yasuo is probably an S tier counter, especially if you're playing with Diana, but this is a champion that is very reliant on being CC'd and like kind of getting punished in lane either by jungler or just in the 1v1. If you can get away with those things and not get punished for them, like Yasuo is really, really strong. I'd say Yone is like kind of the same boat, but maybe a little weaker, like maybe about here. I think Yone is not quite as good a counter as Yasuo, like in the best case scenario, but they're both still very good counters overall, especially if you can pair them with the right things, like in Yasuo's case it's like a Diana or something, in Yone's case like a strong AP jungler. Pretty much any of them works. Zed is another S tier counter in my opinion, similar to these other assassins, can really take over the game in the right situation. If the enemy team doesn't have the tools to like CC him or peel him, he's just going to have a really free time taking over the game. But he is counterable compositionally, which is why, you know, he's much better as a counter pick, in my opinion. Now, Ziggs, probably say... Okay, Ziggs is actually good as a counter, but this is something where you really need to be on the same page. Like, the value of Ziggs is to get a matchup where you can get priority, your team can get Herald, and you can start like taking over the game really fast. If you know how to use Ziggs like you're doing with your jungler, it can be worth it. But I think just in solo queue, like, okay, if this were just solo queue in general, I would say like honestly not very valuable. In fact, just not very valuable at all. But if you really know how to get a lot out of Ziggs, he can be a pretty decent counter, but I'm just not a huge fan of Ziggs at the moment. But yeah, I don't know. You can definitely get value out of it. Zillion should be pretty high on the list, honestly. Maybe like somewhere mid tier here. He's kind of similar to Lulu, but he's like a bit better than Lulu. Probably like somewhere here. So Zillion, very good against certain comps, especially comps that need to just like burst down one target. Can also like slow enemy teams or speed up his teams. So it can get a lot of value. The biggest problem with Zillion as a counter pick is you can't really punish your lane. The best you're getting is a free lane, which is okay, but you're also giving your opponent a free lane. So it might not be the best counter. I definitely don't think it's as good as some of the ones up here. But yeah, it can be good. Zoe. I think Zoe is very high up here, probably about here. If you get a good matchup with Zoe and you can snowball, the champ is extremely oppressive, especially if the enemy comp doesn't really have any hard engage. It can be very difficult for them to deal with Zoe. Potentially an S tier counter, honestly. Like, I'd maybe put her here, but I think I'll put it here for now. I think these other champions do take over the game a bit more, but Zoe is like very good at taking over games as well. So everyone, it's your lucky day. This is Shok from the future. I'm just going to add to this video because yesterday you guys brought up a lot of champions that I didn't include. That's very helpful for me to have that extra feedback on what champions you'd like to see. But again, some of these champions are very obscure and my opinion on them is not going to be super strong because again, I don't see them. Like I got a lot of comments asking about, you know, like Gangplank mid, for example, and saying like, what, like you don't see Gangplank mid? And no, the reality is I don't. I have not seen a Gangplank mid in a very long time. I do have some knowledge on champions like this, but not as much. So you'll definitely have to take my opinion on these a bit more carefully than some of the others. But let's talk about them anyway. So Camille, you can play Camille mid. I think it'd be better versus melee champions. I wouldn't blind pick it in my opinion. It does have good gank setup, so there are some reasons to pick it. In my mind, there are just better things to counter melee champions with. So I probably wouldn't play it. I'd say it's like somewhere in here where it's like, you know, we could counter with this champ, but why not counter with something else? Darius mid, I think Darius mid actually is pretty good. It counters a lot of the melee champions. Again, this is a champ I haven't seen in a while, but I remember when like Nimbus Cloak and Ghost was like a combo that people would run a lot. Darius mid was actually getting played then, and I do still feel like you can play Darius into a lot of the melee mid laners. You have to be careful though, because some of the melee mid laners, like Akali for example, you just like won't actually get to hit them a lot, you know, because they're invis. But if you're against like the fighter melee mids, or some of the assassins that can't really like immune some of your damage or like disengage and stuff like that, I think Darius can be good against them. So I'd say he's probably somewhere up here, honestly. Like he can definitely take over lanes for sure. Snowball's pretty hard. But yeah, it's really not a champion I see very often, and it's also not a champion I play. So yeah, keep that in mind. Caitlyn. Caitlyn is interesting. I've seen a couple people bring up Caitlyn, and I have actually seen Caitlyn mid like maybe once or twice, and I think it is again good versus like short range champions that don't have that great a laning phase. It's kind of like you have to be quite careful with Caitlyn because she has this like big mid game trough unless you build lethality, but then like if you're building lethality, you better be pretty sure that you're not versus tanks. So there is some kind of like niche decision making here when you pick Caitlyn. I think if you're versus either a melee that can't really trade onto you, or if you're versus a range champion that just like kind of doesn't have much choice but to get shot at, you know, like if you're versus like Vex or something, you could maybe do it, but then you have to be like really on point to make sure you don't get altered post 6. Like it's definitely, if you're using this, it's like a high skill counter. And again, it's like I think these champions that Caitlyn counters do have much better counter picks than Caitlyn. Like, yeah, I just don't really see. It's like when I'm thinking of these, right? It's like, why would I counter pick with Caitlyn over something else? And I just can't really think of many reasons to do that. But like obviously, if like no one can play every champion, right? Like I don't think anyone can play every champion to the highest level. So like if Caitlyn's already a champion that you've played, I definitely think you could get some use out of it. But I don't really think she has. Yeah, I don't really think she has a niche. Would be my thing. Gangplank. So you guys have brought up Gangplank mid. Now I have not seen Gangplank mid since about season 10, and apparently it is something you guys see quite a lot. Now to my knowledge, the only two matchups that Gangplank is very, very good in that he actually has a niche in is one, Malzahar, because you can, I believe you can orange the ult. But the main point of this matchup is that you actually get a lot of free scaling. So you can easily just like, well, Malz doesn't really have a laning phase, to be honest, like he's very weak. You can get extra gold from his voidlings, you can push him in, and makes it very, very easy. So that's one of them. And then the second matchup is Akali. So Gangplank is pretty good against Akali. You can just like spam Q poke it down. You can trade into her pretty decently, even if she goes on to you. And obviously like you can impact other lanes. Again, I think the problem with this is like there are already many options into Akali and many way more options into Malzahar. That's like, I'm not really sure why I would pick Gangplank. I guess like the reason is he is one of the few very strong scaling AD champions. You know, like if you really needed a strong AD scaler into, say, Akali, like you don't have great options for that a lot of the time. So I suppose he has some sort of niche. And he is kind of a decent counter. Like I'd say he's probably like in here with the ADCs and like Kayle and Karthus and stuff. Again, though, I don't think it's really a champ that's worth investing into, unless obviously you already play him top or something, because it's just like, you know, you're putting a lot of games into this champion to not get that many great matchups out of it, and you would just be better off learning something else, in my opinion. But, you know, it has use cases. Graves. So Graves was pretty good in the past, like especially against like AD mids or mids with low wave clear that you could really punish. I think this is another case of I think Graves has fallen out of meta a lot because he's not that good against mages, especially mages with wave clear. If you can pick him versus like, yeah, AD or melee champions, can be good. I still think he's a better jungler. You are sort of reliant on having AP on your team. So in my mind, I'm not super enthusiastic about Graves. I'd say he's like somewhat in here. Now, he used to be a lot better mid than he is right now, and I think part of that is just because of the meta. Like I'm, yeah, just not really a fan of Graves at the moment. Kled is interesting. I actually quite like Kled mid. This is a champ that I played quite a lot in season 9, I think it was. So I used to play a fair amount of Kled. Obviously, he has changed quite a bit since then, just because like the meta and stuff. I think it's still good into, yeah, it's like the same as the other champs. It's like good into melees, it can snowball the game and stuff like that. But the real thing is just like, why would I pick this over another anti-melee champion? You know, when I'm thinking about champs I can pick into melees, I've got many more up here that just like destroy melees. And there's just, in my opinion, not much reason to pick Kled over those. That being said, like if you're good at Kled and you can like snowball your lane, he actually does take over the game pretty hard, and like you can roam the bot and stuff like that. So I would say he's somewhere in here, but I just think there's, yeah, I don't know. He's like better than some of the other champs because there are actually like more matchups that you can pick him into, but I don't think that he's as good in those matchups as other champions. So he can be picked more often, but he doesn't have like a super clear niche, in my opinion. Maokai. So Maokai's been reworked and he's definitely better than before. And Maokai mid used to be played a bit back in the day. Now, I think Maokai mid is actually kind of good. It's like it's got gank setup. Obviously, you're quite tanky and stuff like that. The only thing is, again, like in the mage meta, you're kind of just giving free scaling to your opponent. And unless you can set up ganks onto them, but like because Maokai is kind of short range, you can only really do so if they walk too far up or you flash W them, which like does definitely work, right? But you can only do it once every 5 minutes, obviously, and if they like match flashes with you, it can be kind of hard. I do think you can play this against melee champions again, but we've got so many champs that are good against melee champions, and I think also there are just like better tanks. Like I'm not sure what niche Maokai would really have over some of the other tanks on this list. So in my mind, he is not that great. Like he's definitely better as a counter than a blind, in my opinion. But I think you just probably wouldn't pick him that much. I'd probably put him somewhere like, yeah, maybe even in here. Like, I don't think he's a champion that could snow. Okay, if you could snowball your lane hard, like if you decided to take Ignite and you still built tank or like off tank or whatever, he did manage to snowball. Like, it's quite hard to deal with Maokai. Like, I guess he should be higher. Like, if you pick him against an assassin or something, like he's really good. But I think the problem is if the assassin plays well, you can't actually kill them. And while you do neutralize them in team fights, again, it's like we're using a counterpick as a neutralizer, so not something that I'm a massive fan of. Okay, Nasus. So Nasus is actually kind of underrated. I would put Nasus like somewhere up here in my mind. Like Nasus is kind of good. I think that there are a lot of matchups mid that just like do not have the damage to get through Nasus, and Nasus can, like if you're playing mid instead of top, like it's much easier just to take like Ghost or something, and that helps you scale a lot more. I do think Nasus has some kind of weaknesses. Again, like as a counter pick, he isn't often going to kill his opponent. But like the nice thing is you're playing a scaling champion and you get free scaling, so that's kind of nice. Yeah, I think you do kind of have to see the enemy team comp, or at least I would prefer to see it, just because I think you can get kited. Although like maybe that's not too bad if you're taking Ghost mid. So yeah, I think it's good versus melee champions. Probably wouldn't pick it versus much else. Maybe you could pick it against some of the ranged mid laners that don't deal well with tanks and needs a burst. Like I'm thinking if you pick Nasus versus something like Vex, I don't think she could ever kill you. So yeah, I guess it actually has a few situations where you could use it. Poppy. Poppy I think used to be pretty good. I think again the problem is that just like in the meta at the moment, there's just not that many dash champions played mid. So I guess like when Poppy gets like a really good game, she is honestly really strong. Like she would be up here or something, but it's like, how often does this happen? How often do you have like an AP jungler and you verse a ton of like dashes on the enemy team? I just don't think it's that worth investing time into Poppy. Like the perfect scenario where she's super broken is just not going to occur very often. So in my mind, she's more like down here. She does snowball well. She does counter some champions, but I just don't think it happens often enough for it to be worth it. Pyke. So again, I got a lot of comments about Pyke. I think this is kind of interesting. There is like one guy that plays Pyke on my server, and I know there's some Pyke mid one tricks on other servers. I think that Pyke is not really a champion that is specifically like blind picked or counter picked. Like I really think Pyke doesn't care too much about his mid matchup, honestly, because he really just like doesn't like need CS, you know, like he still needs to lane. But most of the time it's like you're kind of just like looking to skirmish and stuff like that. So I'd pick him more based on team comp rather than matchup or anything. But again, like I could be very wrong about that. I'm not someone that plays Pyke mid. But that's been my observation, is that a lot of the Pikes I play against, you know, they're quite happy to have, say, only 30 CS at like 7 or 8 minutes, as long as they're like getting involved in skirmishes and stuff like that. I do think that if you're versus a champion that you can punish for their immobility, like that's probably quite good. Or if you're versus a champion that's not very good at skirmishing, that's probably quite good. And yeah, I guess I would say there aren't many champions that can kill Pyke and lane, but if a champion that like keeps you pushed in and like chunked out could be quite annoying. So I'd actually say this is quite good as a counter, but I would say it's more like you just don't need to think about that a lot of the time as Pyke. At least that's kind of my opinion on it. But yeah, I don't play the champ and I very rarely verse the champion, so could be wrong. Definitely could be wrong. Renekton. So Renekton used to be probably the king of like countering melee's mid, but he's just nowhere near as good as that as he used to be. So yeah, honestly, Renekton is just not that strong a counter anymore. Like I think the time to pick Renekton is probably like with a strong early game AP jungler, like your Nidalees, Talias, stuff like that. And versus a melee champ mid, but I think again, like there are just better champs to do this. Like I'd much rather have, say, I don't know, Riven or, you know, one of these champs up here like Tryndamere if we had something like that. But it is something you could consider. Now Set. So Set is one, again, very interesting. Set used to be a very good blind. I'm going to talk about his blind and counter because he is somewhat played. So Set used to be quite a good blind because he wouldn't get punished in lane at all, and like the game was a very early game focus, so it didn't really matter that you get outscaled. I don't think that's really the case anymore. Like the game is a lot more scaling. Mages like tend to outscale what's his name, Set, as the game goes on, so I don't think he's as good as a blind as he used to be. But he is still a very good counter versus melee champions, and he does have like a lot more use cases than a lot of the other like more niche, like kind of tank bruiser-esque champions. I'd probably put him honestly somewhere like up here, maybe maybe a bit higher. Yeah, I feel like he's kind of similar. He's not quite as good as Singed. He's like somewhere up here. Like he's a pretty solid counter in my opinion. But I think just like the reason that it isn't really played more is because, well, one, like mid laners don't really play Set, at least not anymore. And I do think that you kind of, yeah, you like need a good matchup in my opinion for it to be really worth it. And just like most of the champs that are blind picked are not champions that set counters. But if you do get a champion that set counters, then I quite like it. Viego. So this is another one that I got a lot of comments about. I have not seen a Viego mid since he was like nerfed out of mid lane in mid season 11. So that's a very long time for me. I know there is like a Viego one trick on Korea, but personally I've never watched any of his games. If I remember correctly, the things that moved Viego out of mid lane were nerfs to his sustain. And that meant that he couldn't really be blind picked anymore, and like the problem with the nerfs to sustain was that it also meant that you couldn't counterpick into range champions, and again, like most of the champions that are blind picked at the moment are range champions. So in that kind of vein, it's like similar to Set, where I don't really think Viego has a place. That being said, like especially in low elo when people are blinding things that like aren't really correct, I would say like you can, like he is a good counter to melees, I would say, and he does snowball the game pretty hard. Like he's definitely up here somewhere. I actually probably put him in here as well. I think like there is the possibility that in matchups where even if you get countered, like let's say you verse like a very bad matchup that pokes you down, I think if you can kind of just like equalize and then like fight skirmishes, like that can still be good for you. But I think again, like then you're not like thinking too much about the matchup. Like maybe you'd just be thinking about more like, you know, can I survive this lane? Like, are there going to be enough early game skirmishes and stuff like that? So I think it's a good counter, but I really don't think at least in high elo, the opportunity to counter with Viego, like, and have a good matchup with it is just not going to come up very often. And I think there are just, again, like better champs at that. Like I would prefer, at least, you know, personally, I'd prefer to counter with Tryndamere over Viego or something like that. I think it's easier and I think it's harder to deal with, but like, yeah. And I guess another thing on top of it is Viego is a better jungler in my opinion. But yeah, you could use him. Zac. So this is another interesting one. There is a Zac one trick on my server, so I have seen this champ a little. I've never seen anyone play Zac mid outside of that, so that's like the main reason I didn't include it, but you know, some of you guys say it's played. So in my opinion, Zac as a counter is actually very good. Like I would say potentially S tier or maybe a high A. I think that Zac does very well against a lot of mid laners, and also from mid it's very easy to roam. There's not that many champions that just like hard take advantage of Zac in mid lane. I think like you could blind Zac mid, but I think picking Zac versus like a mobile comps is much better. Like if you're playing against a mobile ADC in mid, it can be very difficult. If you're playing against immobile ADCs in mids, I think that makes it a lot easier, especially against a team that doesn't have great anti-tank. So yeah, I would say he's like definitely in S tier as a counter. But also like, yeah, I don't know. It's just like not many people are going to play Zac, but yeah, it could probably work. Now I got comments about Shyvana. So I've seen a tiny bit. I think I've seen maybe one replay of like the off-tank AP Shyvana mid. So I would say your time you're looking to pick Shyvana is, again, like kind of if you can get a free lane, I would say. After 6, Shyvana's like laning is fine, but pre-6, you're not going to be able to do anything really. I guess like maybe versus some melee champions. I'm just not really sure when I would pick this champion over something else. Like I think there are better AP off tanks like Cho'Gath, You know, there are champs that counter the champs that Shyvana counters better, so I'm not really sure what her niche case would be for solo queue. I guess like the answer would be you could blind it and make people think that it's Shyvana jungle or top, and still play it mid. But I just think, yeah, in my mind, it doesn't really do enough to like warrant countering. I mean, I don't know. Like you could counter melee champs with it and like weak range champs, and like it could be fine, right? But it's just like, why would you over something else? I really don't think it makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, but I don't play Shyvana, guys, so could be wrong. Kai'Sa got nerfed kind of into oblivion. I don't really think she's a mid laner anymore. I guess like if you still are going to play Kai'Sa into something, it probably has to be against a melee champion. I think most ranged champions are going to be too difficult. Like you're just going to have to play regular Kai'Sa now. So you could probably play it into a champ like Sylas. You could probably play it into a champ like maybe Malzahar, just because he's like kind of short range, but then like you would have to build QSS because you're going to be diving in. I guess I would just say like against any matchup where you can get free scaling and also snowball the early game if possible would be good, but I don't think there are that many of these champions that are going to be blinded, so in my mind it's not a very strong counter. It's just like not a very strong mid laner in my opinion. I'd say it's kind of low. Now Kalista and I should put Draven here. So Kalista and Draven are both actually very, very good counters, but they're extremely hard to play, and the opportunity doesn't come up that often. So compared to like, say like Tristana, Lucian, and Akshan, like those sorts of champs, Kalista and Draven can snowball the game even harder. But the problem is like, one, you're sort of ruining your comp by having them. Like they don't really have CC. You're really requiring AP from other lanes, and you kind of need to verse a comp that doesn't really have that much. You know, like just doesn't have. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't have the CC to deal with you. They can kind of get away with it. Yeah, I don't know. I think like both the champs are actually good counters, but I just don't like they're actually very good counters. It's just not really worth the time investment in my mind. Like, you're better off. Like, if you want to invest the time into these champions, you should probably just main them bot because you'll be able to pick them a lot more than mid. But like, if you can get these versus like, yeah, mid laners that you can really take advantage of, especially ones that don't know how these champions work, you can really hard snowball. I think again, it's kind of like the champions that you would counterpick with, like, yeah, the champions that you'd use, or sorry, the champions you would counterpick with Draven and Kalista are just not going to be blinded that often, in my opinion. So maybe it's a bit lower, maybe somewhere like here. They are very good counters, but I don't really value the time investment into them. Like, I think you're investing a lot to get to pick them not often, and if you play these sorts of champions, you might as well just play them bot. But like, if you already play these champs ADC, you could play them mid, and I think it's fine. So last couple ones that we have here, Ivern. So the thing with Ivern is a pretty good counter to a lot of assassins, but he does kind of lack agency. Like, I think it's kind of hard to carry a solo queue game with Ivern if you're just like solo queuing and not like duo queuing or something. So you could pick this, but like, this is a solo queue tier list, guys. It's not a Clash tier list, and it's not a competitive tier list. Like, you could use this for Clash, like, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely not a competitive tier list, and it's not really like meant to be for that. So I think Ivern, like, yeah, I don't know. If you're on comms, you've picked something like Ivern Rengar, like I could see that being good. It could actually be blind picked if you're picking something like Ivern Rengar, especially because people don't really know what to do against it. But I think if you're just purely solo queuing, you could pick it versus Assassins mid, and it would be fine. But I think if you're doing so, yeah, like, if, in my opinion, if you're already doing that, like, yeah, I don't know. If you're already doing that, I would rather have like a Seraphine or like a Zillion or a Karma, maybe. Yeah, like, I don't know. It just feels like its niche is kind of already covered by other champions. But yeah, if you can get it paired with the right jungler, maybe if you duo with them, I could see it work. Okay, last one, Morgana. So where will I put Morgana? I think Morgana is a counter to a couple niche champions like LeBlanc and Zoe. Vex maybe as well. Can also punish champions that don't have much wave clear. I think, again, big problem I have with this is there are other champions that do it better, and I'm not really sure when I would like each of those champions that I'm thinking of, I would have other champs that I'd pick into them first. I'd maybe even be tempted to put Morgana down here. I kind of think she would be better as a blind, just because you could pick her, they wouldn't know it's mid. And you do get priority in a lot of matchups with just your W spam. Like, Morgana used to kind of be like a very strong counter, but she just doesn't really have it anymore. And I think, again, there are other champions that just cover her niche a lot more. So I think that's it. I think this is the actual final tier list. Just to reiterate, because I'm not sure where I'm going to cut the previous video to just kind of add this in, I think that everything in here is basically my own opinion, right? And I think a lot of the, well, not a lot of the champions, but some of the champions, especially the one that you guys have mentioned, they're either champions that I don't play or that I don't see that often, which is why I haven't included them. I've done my best to kind of give the reasoning from what I know of these champions, but they could be wrong, right? I think most of the champions on this list are pretty like well reasoned, or in my opinion, like I have a good understanding of them, but there are definitely some, especially the ones that I just added, that I feel a bit less confident about. So keep that in mind as well. If you guys did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. If you have questions about any of the champions on the list, please let me know. And I did try and give reasoning for most champs, but once again, it's like my opinion, and it's also not just my opinion on the champion, but my opinion on how Counterpick should be used. So I really think like to get a lot out of Counterpick, you should try like win your lane and counter the enemy team compositionally, and like winning lane, not just like getting a CS lead, but actually getting kills. So champions like Victor or Azir that actually are very good in lane, especially as counters, I still think there are just better counters for this, especially for solo queue. Like remember, this is a solo queue tier list, not a competitive tier list. So keep that in mind as well. But anyway, guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you did like it, once again, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.